Hello there, welcome to the Culture of Life podcast from Human Life International. I'm Tad Wojcik, the Mission Research Specialist, here, as always, with Father Shenan Boquet.
Tad, as always, a great joy to be with you, and today discussing more things that are affecting life and family, so it's a great joy.
Yes, of course, Father, and today we're discussing some of these in recent months, and really especially in the last several weeks after the overturning of Roe v. Wade definitively by the Supreme Court. We're hearing a lot of a resurgence of arguments that had sort of fallen on the back burner after abortion basically became kind of accepted, at least legally speaking, throughout the United States. And one of those is the question of the hard cases, and specifically the hard case of so-called abortion in the case of the mother's health, or for the life of the mother, things like this. Even a lot of pro-life legislation in the past few decades has always included some kind of caveat about exceptions for the life of the mother's health, and that's due to a misunderstanding, basically caused by a PR fabrication that the original abortion advocates kind of invented in order to have a better public image for abortion and being able to completely legalize it across the board. So if you want to discuss with us, Father, why these claims are unfounded from a medical perspective, and then where sort of what the history of this kind of idea of abortion for the health of the mother being necessary in some cases comes from.
Well, Ted, it's a very good introduction that you gave for us to really just ponder just the various points that we can address, at least, or try to address today in our time. The first thing, for us to look at is, with the overturning of Roe and Casey, we should expect that those who are advocates for abortion are going to continue to push their agenda forward. They're going to try any means possible to continue what they have become accustomed to over the last 50 years here in the United States. And so, ginning up propaganda and support for their cause has always worked for them with regard to bringing up hard cases. Now, what do I mean by a hard case? And maybe we'll bring up a couple of examples later on. But for example, if we have a situation where a mother, let's say that she's diagnosed with uterine cancer, and she's very early in her pregnancy, or the baby may not be anywhere near viability. So, what do we do in these situations of a moral dilemma? So, in their situation, as you said, they bring these up to gin up support that in this case we need abortion. Well, abortion is never the answer, Tad. It's never the response to these situations. And this is what is so beautiful about Catholic moral teaching, that the Church provides us a path forward in how to address these moral dilemmas. And that's what we're talking about right now, in the case I just gave. What is our response to such a situation? We'll maybe talk about that in a little more detail. But obviously, pro-abortion advocates want to present cases like this, so that they can get the support they want from the general public. Yeah, the life of the mother is at risk here. We need abortion to answer this. Well, this is in my article that I just recently wrote. I'm going to pick it up so I can read a quote from a Dr. Sloan, Don Sloan. And in here, it's a longer quote, and people can look at the link if they're interested. But he says, and medical technology has advanced to a point. Now, this is a person who's an advocate for abortion, but saying very clearly abortion is not necessary. So in this quote, he's making reference like heart disease, diabetes. And he says, so when a woman is pregnant and, is dealing with these medical difficulties, obviously the pro-abortion advocate would say, we need abortion because, her life will be in grave danger if she remains pregnant. And if she tries to give birth, it can cause her great harm. And so what does Dr. Sloan say? He says, and medical technology has advanced to a point where even women with diabetes, kidney disease, can be seen through a pregnancy safely by a doctor who knows what he's doing. We've come a long way since my mother's time. So he's making reference, to some of the medical technology. Not that there's ever a reason for abortion. Abortion is never a viable option, should never be considered as an option, and abortion is not a medical treatment. All right. So the idea here is what he's referencing is at the time, science and technology, medical technology, may not have been as advanced as it is today to address these particular needs. And he goes on, the idea of abortion to save the mother's life is something that people cling to because it sounds noble and pure. But medically speaking, it probably doesn't exist. It's a real stretch of our thinking. So this is an advocate, an abortionist, who is acknowledging that that abortion is not the answer here. So I think it's important for us to look at this and to say, how do we respond? So what is our response, to people who may be facing these kinds of moral dilemmas, where they're pregnant, they have a medical situation that they have been made aware of by their doctor. So what is the response? So we can talk more about that, Tad, in a few moments. But I think it's important to see that what we've seen in the last 50 years is, sadly, as you mentioned, legislation that's been advanced. In the case of the mother's health, abortion is permissible, and of course, we have been saying it's never the path forward, and abortion should never be considered the option in situations like this. And so, we are dealing with two lives, two equally valuable lives: the life of the mother and the life of the unborn child, and we should treat both individuals. And where we can, we should strive to do so in a sense of we should look at the life of both and serve the life of both. And we should never value one over the other. And so what we see, sadly, in the pro-abortion rhetoric is that they're placing a greater value on the life of the mother and not addressing, the fact that there is another life, a life that began at the moment of conception, and that should be treated equally with the same dignity and the same concern. And that if we're going to address an issue that the mother may be dealing with, like I mentioned earlier, with, let's say, a diagnosis of uterine cancer, that, which is a horrible situation for a mother to be facing, not only for her own health in the sense of the cancer, but the life of her child. And so both are in grave danger here. And it's a difficult situation. But the church, in her moral teaching, places before us, principles that we can follow and that we can address the situation that is before us, the moral dilemma. And so this is what is so beautiful about our church, in that in these moments, the church does help us. She does guide us, and she provides moral principles that are based in her tradition in centuries of moral teaching that guide us in such moments. And so it's important. I would just want to point out, just in kind of today, I came with a little show and tell, and because much of our audience may not be aware of some of the documents that guide us in our Catholic principles, especially in our Catholic hospitals and Catholic institutions that serve healthcare, and that is the ethical and religious directives for Catholic healthcare services. And so I point this out so that our audience can see them. And here I have a bookmark, Ted, that really deals with part 4, which is issues in care for the beginning of life. And in my column, I actually quote from some of these paragraphs, to highlight, for example, abortion is never permitted. This is principle number 45. Every procedure whose sole immediate effect is the termination of pregnancy before viability is an abortion, which is never permissible, which in its moral context includes, and then it just goes on. And it also says that Catholic healthcare providers should be ready to offer compassion, physical, psychological, moral, and spiritual care to those persons who are dealing with these difficult situations. But in this case, 46 is dealing with those, who have suffered from an abortion. So the principles are dealing with, again, how we approach these various moments of life and how we approach those that may have already made a decision in the past and now struggling, with the difficulties of the after that decision. So I just say that it's important for us to be familiar, especially our nurses, our doctors, those serving in medical health care, which is a vocation. We're serving human persons. And in this case, Tad, which are sadly our brothers and sisters on the other side of the aisle who are advocating for legal abortion, really sadly do not see the equal value of both mother and child. And so they see one, sadly as a threat versus the fact that both should be treated and seen for their value as with human dignity, and that both should be served. So I think that's our challenge going forward, Tad, is to not be afraid of addressing the situation, not being afraid to talk about those cases, and being able to answer how the church responds and how the church guides us. So I say that in one other, not a little book, but a larger text, which again would be great for our healthcare workers. And this is a book called Catholic Healthcare Ethics, a manual for practitioners. This is the third edition.
If you could hold that up,
I'll hold it up for you. And it's a very large text, but it's one that, in studying bioethics that, I was given in my studies, and it was a great blessing, a great resource, a number of great articles in here that will help guide people who are in the healthcare vocation in how to not only know the Catholic principles, but then how to interpret them, but also how to advance them. So this would be a very good text. But I would say that to anyone interested in these kinds of questions, because by understanding what the Church teaches and what the Church advances helps us to respond, to what our brothers and sisters advocating for abortion or attempting to advance, and how to diminish their influence by being able to answer their questions, or at least be able to show people that abortion is never an answer, nor is it ever permissible, nor should it ever be the path of which we take, in responding to medical dilemmas or ethical dilemmas. And so I'm looking forward to talking a little bit more about that, Tad.
Sure. Well, of course, Father. Now, you kind of addressed a lot of the basic issues in this topic, and I think it's important to note that there's a distinction here, but it's both elements are quite important, but there's a distinction because we talk about how, from a moral standpoint, abortion is quite obviously impermissible. It's right. Intrinsically evil, right? And this is based on the natural law, natural moral law, and something that Catholic doctrine promulgates and promotes, and that's an element of falsehood in the pro-abortion position that needs to be addressed. But there's also this other position which we're addressing in this whole question here of abortion and the health of the mother, that abortion is necessary. In some cases, this is a lie. This is a sort of a pro-abortion propaganda intended to essentially open up possibilities where all kinds of uses of the term health, and this actually comes from the Supreme Court case released alongside Roe v. Wade, which was Doe v. Bolton, that defined health as affecting all sorts of things in such a manner that physicians and other healthcare providers can kind of create all kinds of excuses for abortion, even when there is a pro-life law that includes that clause for the health exception for the health of the mother. And we did address that abortionist whom you quoted, who was, and there are many other quotes from many other abortionists who are pro-abortion and are not in any way pro-life or had some kind of conversion. They were stalwart abortionists who basically said, this is kind of a fabrication. This is political rhetoric that abortion is necessary for life-saving medicine. It's not. It's rather lifestyle-saving medicine. They wouldn't say that, but that is something that that's how we are kind of...
And if the argument works for them, revealing. That's why they continue to be able to find inroads. Mm-hmm. Because they found people who are willing to listen and willing to accept their position. But it's what is good, as you just articulated, is that to have even those who are advocating for abortion in the medical vocation, which I would say they have lost sight of, because a vocation serves human life. It's to be at the service of life, not to take life. And so it's unfortunate, that is out there. But to have these same individuals, admit that abortion is not medically necessary is important for us, because it confronts that false agenda, that false rhetoric, that false narrative. But the reason why the narrative finds its way forward is because it's readily accepted, supported by the main media, and it finds a root. And so that's why I think it's important, as we're doing today, and so many others in our great cause for life have been addressing, and people have been exposing that great lie. So kind of what we're doing today is picking that story back up again, because right now, since the overturning of Roe, this is what the media has picked up. This is what people are given an opportunity to advance this false narrative still. And so, and I think what's important, I was in here in my column, I said, it's true that pregnancy, there are complications. And I make a quote of a couple of them. You have gestational diabetes, you have preeclampsia, you have problems with the placenta. I mean, there are medical situations that arise.
Or ectopic pregnancy.
Or an ectopic pregnancy, or the one I used earlier where you might have a mother who is diagnosed with uterine cancer. And so what do we do? How do we respond? And so it's not that we're denying by any means that there are situations that arise, what we call a moral dilemma. And so, but how do we serve the good of human life? How do we advance human life? And the very fact that, Tad, abortion is never an option, ever. So we must make that very, very clear in how we address these kinds of cases. And so, but we're facing two situations. And how do we serve the good of life, both the good of the life of the mother and the good that is the life of the child. And in some situations, that in the service of life, decisions need to be made in the promotion of life. And so how do we do that? And I think that's what we're going to talk about.
Absolutely, Father, because we now come to the wonderful study of Catholic moral theology, which is extremely complicated, ever more complicated subject as technology has advanced and different kinds of medical operations are possible.
Which has brought about the study of bioethics.
The study of bioethics, right. And it's a common misconception among Catholics that that Catholicism makes an exception to the case of abortion when the life of the mother is in danger. That is not the case. It is never permissible to directly and intentionally kill the forming human being in the mother's womb. However, or anywhere.
Right.
But there are cases where certain operations intended to save the life of the mother inevitably result in the death of a child, but were not performed in such a way that the actual intention of the operation was killing the child. Like in the case of an ectopic pregnancy, we can remove the bit of the case that is the tissue that is pathological is the portion of the fallopian tube in which the embryonic child is lodged, right? And so but it's not the child itself, right? So we are removing, a medical treatment is to remove that portion of the fallopian tube, which inevitably kills the child because there's no way to reinsert the child into the regular portion of the uterus, the womb, at this time.
Right. So why don't we maybe present the principles, and
Sure.
maybe we can kind of go through that process.
This is an example of the case of the principle of double effect being applied to this, and you can go ahead and explain that.
So what I did is I brought some materials because making sure that we understand them in order then to apply them, and because it's such an important subject, I want to make sure that I'm explaining it, in a way that's clear, but also just presenting those principles clearly for us to understand. So I brought a couple. So I'm pulling from the Catholic Healthcare Ethics. In this case, Dr. Edward Furton, in one of the articles in the book, where he just says, may one perform, is a question, may one perform an action which is intended to achieve a good effect if it is foreseen that an evil effect will also result? And that's, in a sense, Tad, what you just gave as an example when we're dealing with an ectopic pregnancy. And I'll go back to my original example when we're dealing with an issue like a mother that's diagnosed with uterine cancer. So, but I'm just even stepping away from the health of the mother, okay? Let's just kind of look at the fact I could be diagnosed because of with diabetes and because of maybe a lack of care on my part, not following my doctor's guidance. There may come a part where, I may have to have my leg amputated, because of, damage. And why? So what happens here? So obviously my integrity of being able to walk, my ability to move about is very important to my health and my well-being. But if I don't do something with my leg that has become very sick and in a sense of a pathology, if I don't, then I'll lose my life. I will die because of what's happening. So in this situation, there is a good here. My life is a good. The health of my life, living, is a good. And so, but in order, to reach that good, to serve that good, there's something that has to occur. And the bad effect is I would lose my leg. So I lose my ability in some manner to walk as I normally can with both of my legs. And so that's an example again here. So the intention is not, to maim me. The intention is not to cause harm to me. The intention is not to cause a handicap, but to address the pathology, which, if unaddressed, will ultimately cost me my life. So let's kind of now move that. So I'm going to, do with the principles. So here, the principle of double effects governs situations in which one action is followed by two effects. So we just made it. The good effect, which is intended. So the doctor is addressing the pathology that is my leg that is sick in a sense of in a bad situation, needs to be amputated. And the other, which is foreseen, but it's not intended. So the doctor is not trying to, as I said, to cause me harm. He's not trying to maim me, make me handicapped in any way. He's attempting to save my life. He's attempting to keep me healthy and to serve a good. So this is what the principle is dealing with. So I'm going to read the principles. So I apologize in the sense of the detail, but I think it's so important to add. So first of all, the moral principle of double effect. So the act itself must be good. So you mentioned earlier, abortion is an intrinsic evil. So it's bad in and of itself. It's an evil, and it can never be chosen. So I cannot choose that an evil and then try to redefine it as something good. Abortion is an intrinsic evil and can never be permitted. So the direct taking of an unborn life is never permissible. So this is very important. So the second principle, intend only the good effect. So as I just noted here, so just using the issue of my leg being very in a bad manner, and it's a pathology, it's unhealthy, it needs to be addressed. So, but the intention here of the doctor is my health, my well-being, and the foreseen effect is I will only have use of one leg. And I may even have complications because of the amputation that will still need to be addressed, some difficulties, healing, and so forth. But again, that's the foreseen. It's the bad effect that is caused by serving the good. And so the good, third principle, the good has to come about of its own, and has to precede, the evil effect. And so here, you can't do evil to achieve a good. So just kind of very important here. So the good has to come about on its own. So here, so many times, you hear people, back to the idea that, we have the health of the mother in the situation. Again, let's use the example of the cancerous womb, uterus. And so we must have an abortion in order, to choose an abortion in order to save the life of the mother. No. You cannot choose that which is evil in order to bring about a good. We've seen this sadly in our human history where many people have done very evil things in order to, quote unquote, bring about some type of good. We can never choose that. The fourth, it must be a proportionally grave reason to do so. So keeping those four principles in mind, an act itself must be good, the intent only the good effect. Thirdly, the good has to come about on its own and has to precede the evil effect. And fourthly, it must be a proportionally grave reason to do so. So in the situation of, let's just say back to the cancerous uterus. So the life of the mother and the child are of equal value. So there is no arbitrary approach to this. Both must be served. That has to be the beginning. And the intention here is serving both. But in serving both, we realize that there is a foreseen effect that is going to happen. Because if we don't do anything, the mother and the child will die. So this is a dilemma. So how do we address it? We use the moral principle of double effect to address it. So the uterus, removing it's the pathology. The child is not the pathology. The child should never be the intention. The pathology is the uterus, is the cancerous uterus. And if unaddressed, then mother and child will die. So all we want to do is remove the pathology only. So we're intending the good, though we have a foreseen. So the death of the child is not what brings about the good. It's very important here. So it's the removal of the cancerous uterus that brings about the good. The foreseen effect is the fact that the child cannot survive. Now, but let's back out for a few moments. Because both are of equal value and must be served, in the principles that I here in the ethical and religious directives that I pointed out earlier, if you get into part 4, it explains. So, for example, I'm going to pull the quote. Operations, this is number 47, operations, treatments, and medications that have as their direct purpose the cure of a proportionately serious pathological condition of a pregnant woman are permitted when they cannot be safely postponed until the unborn child is viable. So one of the questions that would need to be asked before we move in any direction is, can we move to a point where the infant child can reach viability? And so where the child can live outside the womb. So we're serving both lives. And so if we're in that situation and we can do this, we must strive, to move in that direction, because both lives are of importance and must be served. So we don't place a value higher on one or the other. And sadly, the rhetoric we were talking about earlier obviously has no concern, for the life of the child, and approaches the conversation that only the health of the mother is to be served. This is not proper moral teaching and the proper application of respecting human life. Both lives, Tad, must be served. But the church makes it clear that, there are ways in which we can approach this. The first is, can we reach a level of viability? And if we're near or very close, or we already have moved, where the child can survive, the decision is to serve the life of both, and we can deliver the child earlier and then serve the life of both child and his mother and child in the situation. And so these are the principles that are there. But let's go back and say now that we're dealing with a child that is not viable, and that we're very far away from reaching that viability, and that we're, again, dealing with a situation that is very much life-threatening to both mother and child. And so
before the point of viability could be reached.
Exactly. So what do we do? So let's go back to my example of the cancerous uterus. So here we have a pathology. It's the uterus, the cancer, that is the pathology. And so applying the principle of double effect, the first is the act itself must be good. Removing the cancer, is a good. Why? Because cancer kills. And if left unattended, it will kill the mother and the child. So not to address it, obviously, causes that is the harm, all right? The second thing is, if we foresee, even though we foresee, the bad effect, okay, it's not the intention. So we're not directing the act at the child. That would be a direct abortion. We cannot do that. It is never permissible. But the act of removing the cancerous uterus has a foreseen effect, what we call a bad effect. The child who is not in a viable situation cannot survive outside the womb. So we foresee the death of the child, but it's not the intention. Third, the good of removing the cancerous uterus is not brought about by the death of the child. What brings about the good is the removal itself of the cancerous uterus. This is what helps the mother to be able, the woman, to survive. All right? So it's not the death of the child that brings about the good. It's the removal of the cancerous uterus. So the intention and the act that is chosen, which is the first and second principle, is very, very important. And then fourthly, proportional grave reason. We're dealing with two lives. So there is a grave reason here to address this. And so that is what moves us to this decision making, this ethical decision that must be done. So it's important, as whether we're talking about, as you brought up an example, Tad, about an ectopic pregnancy. We could be dealing with other medical situations that occur, in our daily lives that bring us into these kinds of situations. And what's so beautiful about our Catholic teaching is that it provides a path forward in dealing with these ethical dilemmas, which happen every day around our world. And what's so beautiful is that the Church guides us in these moral decisions, helps us to always maintain the good and seek the good, intend the good, want the good, and serve human life. We should never, ever intend the death of another human being in order to obtain a good. And so it is a tragic situation when a mother and child are placed in this situation, and both lives need to be served and are to be loved and are to be respected, and they should be defended. And these kinds of decisions, that's why the fourth principle is so important, Tad, a grave reason. It needs to be proportionate. And so that, if we can avoid this situation by, for example, if a child is nearing viability, can we provide medical care that can move us to that moment where we can mitigate the aggression, let's say, again, back of the cancerous uterus? Is there a way to get us closer to that viability so that the life of the child can be served and be able to allow the child to be able to live? And so we need to do that. And, and then at the same time, I think of St. Gianna Molla, which is I talk about in the column, who herself a medical doctor, pregnant, diagnosed, with cancer, and so, but makes a decision moving toward viability. And of course, in that time, viability was obviously much further down than it is today because of our advances in medical technology and science. And so, but that was the decision she made. And so she mitigated by taking medication that would not cause harm to her unborn child, and at the same time try to slow down the aggression. And then once the baby was born, and then she would decide to take the treatment. And of course, in that particular situation, the treatment did not help her. But what Gianna did was she served her life and she served the life of her child. She loved her life and loved the life of her child. And this is how we should approach this. That's why the narrative of these so-called hard cases, is false. It really is false. Abortion is not a medical treatment. It doesn't change the situation. For example, if we abort the baby because of a cancerous uterus, if that is the intention, it doesn't change the result of the cancerous uterus. So it's the uterus that is the problem. It is the cancer that is the issue, I should say. That is what is the pathology, not the baby, not the unborn child. And so it's the same thing dealing with an ectopic pregnancy, and then we can apply it to other things. And in very similar, to, as I mentioned earlier, using the example of a very severe case of diabetes that's caused grave damage to my leg, that causing the decision to address it by removing my leg, which now impairs me. But that was never the intention. So those principles, Tad, are very important, and we could go through a litany of examples here. But what's good about this, and I would say this to all of our listeners, because every day around the world, we face these kinds of dilemmas. I was just recently in Puerto Rico, for the Catholic Daughters of the Americas Convention, and we had sadly 3 of the delegates in the convention suffer some grave medical problems. One died today, actually, and the family reached out and asked questions, about the situation, and what could they do? What was ethically permissible? What were the moral, principles to help guide them, in the decision, of health care? Because they want to follow the good, they want to do what is good for their loved one, but realizing that the medical situation is very dire, and very little that medical science can now do for their loved one. But at the same time, they don't want to do something that would cause harm, that was immoral, and not morally permissible. So we face these kinds of questions, not just with our sisters who are with child, but across serving human life. So that's what's beautiful about these principles. They apply, and they help us. So I'm hoping, that our conversation today in some way, provides some guidance. But because we've such limited time and not being able to go through more examples, but the ethical and religious directives that is published by the United Catholic Conference of Catholic Bishops here, United States Catholic Conference of Bishops in the United States, and also, the Catholic medical care ethics that I showed earlier. I'll just show it again. It's very, very, very good. I'm trying to put it in the camera so that you can see it. But there are many other texts out there. And I would also, just say that, we ourselves here at Human Life International, rely upon others who are dealing with these issues daily. And one of those groups that we work with very closely is the National Catholic Bioethics Center. And I mention them by name because they have a wonderful 24-hour hotline, if you will, to help people in these kinds of decision making. And I say that because that's a great resource, because when we're facing these kinds of moments, it's nice to be able to turn, towards those that we can trust in guiding us in these moral decisions. So that's an example, that I would say, and I do. I rely upon much of their work in guiding, and helping explain, the Church's teaching in this regard. So I'm hoping that's a little helpful today, Tad. The article will have some links and provide a little more discussion. And I'm hoping that our audience will go back and read that column.
No, absolutely, Father. I mean, it's an extremely complicated issue. The question of the principle of double effect, just within general moral theology, because actually the same principle applies in the cases that have nothing to do with abortion, et cetera, exactly. Like in the cases of self-defense and things of that nature. But in particular, in these medical questions, when medical capabilities are constantly evolving, et cetera, it makes things very complicated because, for example, if there was a way to preserve the life of a child, who was in an embryonic form still, but it was in an ectopic pregnancy, then that action would be the action to take rather than anything that would result in the death of the child.
Exactly. And I would say, Ted, as medical science advances, this is the good, of medical science. There is much good. And at the same time, there can be much bad that is done if we misuse our gifts and misalign our intentions and directions of our skills. Our doctors are the service of life. That's why we refer to it as a medical vocation, to serve human flourishing. And it's tragic when our doctors and those in healthcare, are not serving life and instead advocating, for abortion and other, practices that are immoral. And so it's important for us, to look at that. And it applies in many other manners. So thank you for saying that. I think it's good for all of us to be reminded of that.
And absolutely, Father, because the other element of this is that the principle of double effect is a moral method of determining the, minimal permissible action. Some people kind of misinterpret it as this is how you determine the right course of action. It's not necessarily the case. It's what is the boundary line of what's permissible, right? And this applies to questions of all kinds of questions, vaccine ethics or self-defense, et cetera. Exactly. But there, you mentioned the case of Gianna Barrettomola. Right. She performed an action that was a little more within, a little closer from that boundary, I guess you should say, further back from that liminal boundary. And so there's lots of options that take things into account.
I would just say, I'm thinking, of other example of which we won't have time to go into. But let's say that we're on a boat, with 5 other friends, and we're out fishing, and something happens, the boat is sinking. Everyone's, I'm the best swimmer, and everyone is having difficulty. They say they're drowning, but I can't save all 7. So how does this principle also help in those kinds of situations? Because everyone's life there is of equal value. How do I choose? So I think it's very important that we see how the Church's Catholic principles and moral teaching affect us on every part of our life. And if we learn them and we apply them properly, they do give us guidance. I mean, they do help us, to help us in these kinds of ethical dilemmas and moral dilemmas that we face. And sometimes people face them more often than others. Firemen going into burning buildings. Doctors. In situations of life and death. And like I said, the doctor went in to do some type of work on my leg to save my leg, but in the middle of the surgery, can't do it. So what does he do? How does he address it? And so these are things that we should talk more about. And I think that was the whole purpose of the column, was not only to talk about the narrative of the pro-abortion agenda, but again, it gave us a chance, Tad, that we're doing right now, and that is to show how it's applicable to so many other areas of human life. And sadly, so many of our Catholic brothers and sisters, and so many of those in the Christian faith, are unfamiliar with the moral principle of double effect, or unfamiliar with the Catholic principles that we're advocating for here right now. But if we talk about them and we catechize and we help form, then people are better prepared in how to deal with these kinds of cases, even toward the end of life. I mean, when we move toward, our illness, growing up older in age, and facing, decision makings at those stages, like the person I mentioned in Puerto Rico, who had a massive stroke. And everything was, the brain itself was very severely damaged. So many things were happening, and the body was starting to shut down, and things. So what do we do? How do we approach it? And in that situation, there were a number of priests, who were there, and they were able to reach out and say, can you give me some guidance? Sadly, many times our people don't have access to our priest in those situations. And that's why, again, working with doctors and working with nurses and those in the healthcare profession, and obviously every level of those serving human persons, if we can help educate and form and then expose the false narrative and say that's not true. That does not have to be the answer, and that is not the case. Then we're able to serve life. And in this case, as we talked today, both lives, the unborn child and the mother. But that's why HLI takes such a strong interest in this and educating those who serve other people, because the more that we are aware of it, then the better our ethical decisions will be, and we can then serve life and love life. That's what this is about,
Absolutely, Father. And to that end, some of the materials you've mentioned, we'll provide links to. Good. Because the Church offers, the ethical and religious directives, as well as the various Vatican documents on right. Different specific cases of applying this principle, whether it's the case of the so-called abortion for the health of the mother, and other instances of this principle's application. So, with that in mind, Father, I think we've pretty much discussed this topic, this very complicated topic, as best as we can. And just as a final note, kind of a summary for our folks at home, that maybe we can mention that abortion is touted often as necessary in some cases, to save the health of the mother. In other words, saying that abortion is a medical treatment, at least in those cases, right. And is the only option. And what we're saying is that in almost every case, it has no relevance whatsoever to directly abort the child. And even if that were an option such that it is going to provide the benefit of the mother's health, there are also other options. In other words, it's never necessary to directly abort the child, and never permissible, right. And never necessary.
Right. Exactly. So I think it's important to start with those latter points. Mm-hmm. Never permissible, never something that can be chosen.
Never morally permissible, never morally able to be chosen, and not even ever medically necessary.
Exactly. And that's the whole point of what the article was, because I think that's how the other side gins up their advocacy, if you will, mm-hmm. because they use these very difficult cases as leverage. But we all know that as you just said, that it's false. There are real cases. We've talked mm-hmm. about some of them. There are real cases. There are real issues. But abortion is never the answer. It's not a medical treatment. And I think we just need to continue to reject their agenda and be bold enough to say it's an outward lie. It's deceptive. And that's why Dr. Sloan, as I quoted, and others I mentioned in the article, make it clear. And these are people that advocate for abortion. So they know that it's not true. So the response to this is by using the case that we talked about, a couple of the examples, is a way to address it. And by understanding the Catholic Church's moral principles, we're able to address these moral dilemmas, which do happen. None of us here are denying that there are not hard cases. Now, and our definition of hard case is there are medical realities that occur. The Church does not deny them, all right, and just pretend they don't exist. Of course they exist. We talked about them. But abortion is never, ever a viable option. The direct taking of an innocent human life is never permissible. And abortion is the direct intention of taking a human life. Can't do it. And so what is our response? And that's why when people say, well, then what do I do? We have to be prepared to answer that question. And I'm hoping that today, that we've done a fair job of helping people to be able to answer such questions and to direct them in a way that can point them to find the resources they need to be able to get that. Because obviously they're not always going to have someone like you, Tad, or someone like me, or always someone like the National Catholic Bioethics Center at a hand's grasp to be able to answer. That means we have to be educated. We have to be formed, which is what we're doing today. And the more that we're knowledgeable of what the Church authentically teaches, we can bring down the false narrative, and we can address it and not be afraid of it. So, if tomorrow you were called, Tad, to Fox News and they had a hard case for you, so to speak, hard case, no doubt you would be able to answer their situation because you're familiar and knowledgeable and comfortable in the Church's teaching and can articulate it. So that narrative comes down. And so that's what we have to do. And I'm so grateful for those that are in those situations, who are given those opportunities. The more that we do it, the less opportunity. Now, I will close with this. My comment would be, let's get back to the abortion debate. So now that it's been thrown back to the states, this is where we've got to take this argument, because that's why they're raising it again. Because they're raising many cases, and we know that the media is not on our side, Ted. They're on the advocating side of abortion. So we know where they're at. So we're not going to. So they're going to continue to raise these cases, and they're going to put them out there as if they're objectively true. And so we're not being able to. We got to get out there. We have to inform people that this is not the answer. And so on the state level, we need to make sure that we help our lobbyists, our legislators, educate people on the ground about these issues. So this is where we got to step forward, and we need to write articles to the editor. Reject, if something's put out there, get out there and write about it, respectfully, always. But we need to not be afraid. We have an answer. We know the ethical means forward. We have the proper means and tools given to us through the moral principle of double effect and other principles of Catholic teaching that can guide us. And not just for Catholics. These moral principles have been with us for centuries. And as you said in the very beginning, the whole the natural law. So we know what we can draw upon. Let's get out there. Let's take it to them. Right? That's what I'm saying, in a very respectful manner, but take it to them. Do not be afraid. Don't let the lie continue.
Absolutely, Father. Well, thank you very much then for traipsing through these difficult waters with us. And once again, we just recommend to our listeners and viewers to follow the links in the description to the article where Father has other links, to follow the links to the ethical and religious directives, and other materials which we will provide, and the HLI website, which has all sorts of resources on these issues. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for being here, Father.
You're welcome.
Everyone watching our videos, please follow us on Rumble and YouTube. We'd maybe prefer at this time that you would start migrating over to Rumble, as well as if you're listening on any of our audio platforms, continue to follow us and share us with your friends on Amazon, Spotify, etc. Thank you so much for watching, and keep on loving the culture of life. God bless.